nicely, Madame Crosset already mentioned the international picture, which leads us basically to our next session, where we plan to spend the next 30 minutes or so on the international cooperation of regulators in the field of pediatric medicines. And with great pleasure, we have Sandra Kweder with us. She's the Deputy Director of the Europe Office of FDA and also liaison to the European Medicines Agency. And basically, she will tell us about the US and system and the collaboration between the US or FDA and EMA on pediatric development, which shows a bit that the common understanding that pediatric development goes beyond regional issues. It's really a global development driven first by initiatives in the US, which were then later on taken on board also in Europe with our legislation. Still, we basically are interacting, also sometimes perhaps competing a bit or getting inspiration from each other. For the development of our regulatory frameworks, and there is a lot of cooperation going on between both sides, mostly sometimes cooperation which is a bit behind the scenes or it's not so visible, but is very effective and is very pertinent for driving pediatric development forward. And so I hope you will also be able a bit to lift the curtain of the secrets and the secret interaction behind the scene to make them more visible and to really show also the benefits of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian and Enrica, for inviting me to participate today. I think pediatrics is an important topic, and pediatric illness doesn't know geographic boundaries. And for the most part, pediatric needs don't have a great deal, don't have very many geographic boundaries. And so I'm happy to report that the pediatricians at FDA, the people who are concerned about pediatrics, enjoy a wonderful partnership with our European colleagues at EMA and beyond, and I'll give you some illustration of that. And this is not only FDA and EMA, but we engage regularly with regulatory bodies that have similar concerns around the world. So here's my disclaimer. The opinions are mine and do not necessarily reflect the views of FDA. I'm supposed to say that, but I think largely they do. And I think as a general theme, regulatory, my perspective is that regulatory science and public health, and nothing could be more true that when it comes to public health and pediatrics, with or without light and air. And the rapid pace of technology and exponential complexity of science in medicines, in the development of medicines, really warrant both. They warrant open, non-judgmental discourse. We need to debate vigorously from our different perspectives, and society will hold us accountable for bringing transparency and creativity to fields where there are great needs, such as pediatrics. And FDA and EMA have many connections and collaborations in this space. We have ad hoc topic discussions on individual products. As I'll show you some workshop participation. We have some formal engagements that connect on a very regular basis. But our mutual goal is to have strong connectivity in critical areas around pediatrics. And as I've mentioned, we don't do this with just bilaterally, but we engage other experts from around the world as well. The pediatric cluster, I still don't understand the history of why these platforms are called clusters, but this one was established in 2007, so it's over 10 years old. This group, which is large and robust, meets at least monthly to discuss among regulators a multitude of issues, products, and development programs. And they're actually really good at tracking what they do. From 2007 to 2018, they held 125 teleconferences, okay, 125, and discussed 473 product-specific issues, as well as 156 general topics. A general topic might be trial design in pediatrics, extrapolation, safety concerns about a particular product area, those more general things. And they've actually even looked at, this group has actually even looked at how often the participants reach some sort of comfortable convergence on a direction for a pediatric product. And their estimate is, and these are sometimes hard to measure, about 75% of the time over that over the calendar year of 2017. They haven't been tracking this all the way back to 2007. But the kinds of things that they've discussed are some of the things that I've mentioned, but also really dive into details on specifics of endpoints in pediatric trials, the design themselves, the specific study population, specifically to try and find some common ground on pediatric development programs. So why would they do this? It's because everyone recognizes that resources in pediatrics are scarce. And sometimes in these conditions, you only have one opportunity to do a trial. So it really needs to meet a broad variety of perspectives and needs. One of the things that this cluster has started doing is trying to identify therapeutic areas where there is need, where perhaps there isn't a lot of formal guidance on a topic, and issue documents that they call a common commentary, a tool to inform sponsors about products or product areas that they've discussed. 1 to 2 pages, high-level issues to give companies who are developing these products or thinking about developing these products some early perspective on what the regulators are thinking about what may be needed. And these have been very successful. We've had companies come to the cluster and say, can we have a common commentary on this particular topic? And the response is, we're not taking requests, but we are trying to look for ripe areas for us to do this. This group participates and organizes workshops and working groups. You can see some of them listed here. They've developed some guidelines together, such as through Gaucher's disease, following workshops and multiple meetings. More recently, have been working very intensively on pulmonary artery hypertension, and lots of other separate work streams developing pediatric therapeutic areas. They work together. These same participants come together through the International Council on Harmonization. They exchange experts visiting each other's agencies to learn about thinking and approaches to pediatric product development and some of the challenges that people have. And they also participate, they sponsor, regulate workshops and meetings together, as well as try to come together and tackle challenging topics at pediatric-specific conferences that go on over the course of a year. They converge in consortia, and here are some examples. The Neonatal Consortium, trial networks, they try to come together in those places as well, so that they're all trying to, seeing what everyone else is contributing and keeping up. So what influences the collaborations of these groups? And I think these are important considerations. Well, for one thing, if you think of them as, I have FDA and EMA and other global regulators up there as a Venn diagram, if there's legislation from one region, what happens is it starts to push on that interface with the other regions, because what's required in Europe will affect how FDA or Japan has to think about a development program. We have to be flexible. We have to modulate, because, again, we may only have one opportunity to develop a particular therapeutic area, so we've got to be able to encompass the requirements that each of us are facing. So, for example, FDA's requirements for pediatric development plus EMA's PIPs have required a lot of shifting and being willing to be flexible on the part of all participants. And there's no question that societal shifts affect us all. And they don't always take the shape of a specific legislation. We hear different things. It's up to us as regulators to compare what we're hearing and what we're seeing coming down the pike, and how we may have to adapt collectively to take those factors and societal demands into account. So what have we learned about international collaboration through this cluster? This is hard work, okay? And it's not, and I always say, it's often not what people consider part of their day job. It's not in their job description. And to do it well, we've learned, I can say at FDA, that the collaboration has to be resourced. It has to be resourced. FDA, I can tell you, has 2 people full-time, 2 pediatricians, full-time. All they do is work on this. That's all they do. Okay? It's a lot, and they're just the tip of the iceberg. And I know my colleagues at EMA work hard on this collaboration. It's a lot of work. The other thing we've learned is it takes courage to change. We all come to these collaborations with our minds, we've got a picture in our heads of what a development program should look like or what a study endpoint should look like. And then we hear our regulatory peers from somewhere else in the world, and they've got a different idea. And boy, it's hard to take a step back and reframe and reshift. So the earlier we can have those engagements, the easier that becomes for us collectively. And and similarly, what is needed? We're talking today about identifying needs. What is needed can change overnight. A major scientific discovery can wipe out what was perceived as a need, or can open up a whole host of new needs that we weren't smart enough to think about last year. I think one example of one of the pushes that we're going to be seeing was already mentioned, the Race for Children Act. This is a requirement of FDA. And this is an act that was passed by our Congress last summer that allows FDA to require evaluation of new molecularly targeted drugs and biologics that are intended to treat for treatment of adult cancers, but could be directed at a molecular target that's relevant in a pediatric cancer that may not be the same as the adult cancer, to be studied. And so FDA must require clinical trials of those medicines, okay? So drug A treats lung cancer in adults, for instance, by tracking molecular target ZFG. Okay, there is no lung cancer equivalent in the pediatric population, but we know that there's a different pediatric cancer that has this same molecular target at its root. And RACE requires FDA to require studies of that other cancer in children, okay? Molecularly targeting this which means that the company will have to do clinically appropriate studies with a clinically appropriate formulation and begin to, and really just test these. And it also eliminates the orphan exemption for these pediatric cancers, which is something that's been a little bit of a noose around our neck. FDA's job in this is that we have to do something, somewhat like you're trying to do today, but establish a list of relevant targets, molecular targets, establish a list of non-relevant molecular targets. We have to do those by this coming summer and seek broad input in that, working particularly with our National Cancer Institute, but also many other stakeholders. And we're supposed to issue guidance on how we're going to make companies do this within 2 years. However, we have to actually implement it this coming year. The broad input part is a lot of work, and while we're getting broad input, you can see on the bottom of this slide, we have 2 hearings scheduled for 2018, one in April, one in June. We're still required to start implementing the requirement this summer. Okay, even while we're still developing the lists. So we have to start advising companies now and telling them, you need to be thinking about what your pediatric study plans are if you are going to submit a new drug application for marketing beginning in August of 2018. So this is a true race. What do we need to do? We're really looking forward to discussions with and collaborating with EMA and our other international colleagues. And honestly, we haven't quite figured out what that collaboration is going to look like. You know, we're trying to invent it as we go along. But you can be sure that the pediatric cluster and the oncology cluster will be discussing this together at great length. And we greatly look forward to those discussions. So I think that what I want to say is that this pediatric cluster and our regulatory interfaces in the world of pediatrics and finding ways to be creative particularly and bring transparency, robust discussion, and real creativity to the field of pediatrics is really the fundamental goal of our endeavors internationally. And I will stop there because I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussion by others.
Thank you very much for this great overview. Are there any immediate questions, comments from the audience?
One short question. Thank you very much. You said that 73% of the cases, there is a convergence in between FDA and EMA, which means that 1 out of 4, you don't agree.
That's right.
So in this situation, how often it was that what was accepted requested in the US and requested in Europe were not at all compatible for the companies?
I think it depends on what you look at, on what those what those are. What we actually really try to do is we try to take into account perspectives that are different and work them into a single development program. So, for instance, let's say there's a clinical trial endpoint that one region thinks is most important, and perhaps it's because prior products that have been previously developed have used that endpoint, and ultimately you want to be able to make some sort of comparison, even if you can't do a head-to-head trial. The other region got to this point from a very different direction and has a different set of endpoints that they've historically utilized. What we try to do is bring in the endpoints to common ground on a single trial. Maybe one group considers them primary, one group considers them secondary, but we try to have some flexibility so that all needs can be taken into account.
Does it mean that over time, the number of this situation is reducing?
Yes, I would say definitely, definitely, yes.
And did you identify some real important topic where you need, beyond specific product, really to sit together and maybe with experts just to solve this?
Irmgard, I'd like to hear from you.
My name is Irmgard Eichler, and I'm working at the Pediatric Medicines Office, and I am the counterpart from the FDA organizing for these pediatric clusters here from EMA part. And if you're asking for specific examples, let's take antibiotic trials, antibiotic pediatric trials. There is a difference between US and FDA, EMA and FDA with regard to what is considered the main primary endpoint. One would like to see the treatment after 3 to 5 days. The other would like to see as primary endpoint test of cure, for instance. But it is possible to have both endpoints in one clinical trials and then do different statistical analysis plans to fulfill the various different endpoints. With regard to feasibility of antibiotic trials, for instance, it is well recognized that they are not really progressing as we would like to. We now have jointly organized by EMA and FDA, we will organize a workshop on how the conduct of pediatric antibiotic trials, for instance. So identifying the differences is a first step, then trying to find a way, is it possible to converge or harmonize or not? And if not, for the time being, discuss together ways of what in the future can be done to improve the situation.
Yeah, I see it there.
Patricia Blanc from Unite to Cure. Thank you very much for this very clear presentation about the Race for Children Act. This is really a regulation that we would have lacked actually in Europe as parents. And I was wondering, how do you see today the possibility of interaction between Europe and the US for first defining the targets, because that's the list that needs to be done within the next 2 years, and also having, that kind of regulation in Europe?
Well, I can't speak to the regulation in Europe, but I can speak to our interest in input from our European colleagues particularly on the science and the molecular targets. And that was what I was referring to, is we've really got to figure out what collaboration means in that area on this very rapidly moving timeline. And so that's something that my colleagues back home are really taking into serious consideration, because they recognize that they're not once you start these programs, it's going to, that Venn diagram, it's going to push on on everyone else as well. So we need to have some broad input, not just U.S. focused.
Okay, there was Angelique.
Thank you very much. This is Angelica Siopkar. I'm the UK delegate for PDCO. A comment and a question to all of them in the room. First of all, the comment is regards with the work that has been happening in the clusters, which is extremely helpful for colleagues in PDCO and myself to discuss global developments. But I think what needs to be taken into consideration is two aspects. One is there are differences in clinical practice across the ponds, and this has to be reflected on clinical trials design. So you heard from Imgard perhaps feasibility issues on endpoints, but also on placements of products within clinical pragmatisms. So from that point of view, it's important to think that through. And for the academics in the room, it's very important for rare diseases where you have less opportunity in terms of patients, that we actually get a clear steer on those clinical practice to align our clinical trials with. And the second point is that when we discuss, if you like, regulatory requirements, we need to think that these are tending for licensing purposes. And again, we have to consider the licensing process and the licensing, if you like, competent authorities of interpreting the data and how those can be aligned. And I have an example of a recent teleconference last week where there was a disagreement on the endpoint and on whether placebo or not was a good idea, and you can argue things in science, perhaps both ways. But at the end of the day, where we left it is perhaps the company should do a feasibility assessment and say, is this trial really feasible within the UK, within the Europe, in clinical practice, or is it in US, again, taking into consideration as that. So I do think there is a point of academia helping us a little bit with the clinical trials. It's just not us. And the question, perhaps to the colleagues of FDA and EMEA, UK is leaving Europe sort of soonish, or maybe transitioning, or whatever the politicians say. And is it important to consider how we move forward in terms of international cooperation at that level? And I know it's highly political. I'm not interested in politics. I'm interested in continuing the collaboration between regulators. Thank you.
respond? I think the examples that you cited about those are when we look at the 73% and where there are differences that where we've not reached full alignment, they usually do come down to clinical practice differences. I mean, almost always, and so we try to work those out, we try to talk them through, but ultimately what happens in clinical practice and perspectives on clinical practice will drive the feasibility of trials in particular regions. So we have to be realistic about that, and as the description by Irmgard, try to see what we can do to pull together a development program that takes all of that into account in a relatively seamless way is really our goal. As for further collaboration, you might have noticed on the slide, future collaborations, this is not just an FDA and EMA interface. We already involve other regulatory agencies. So we expect that will continue.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andy Pearson. Now, I fully appreciate how much you emphasise how much hard work this involves in international collaboration. I think with the Race Act, actually, it further has diversified the regulation Europe versus US. But I think I'm making a plea that actually this presents a unique opportunity, and over the next 2 years to get much greater international alignment, and I think this would benefit all stakeholders, the patients, the parents, academia, and the pharmaceutical industry. So I think this is a unique opportunity as you look at the implementation of race, and the European Commission looks about potential change in the regulation. So I see it as a great opportunity, and I think it's one that I sincerely hope will be grasped and not wasted.
Thank you.
Mark Turner, the best way to praise something is to copy it, or imitation is the best form of flattery. So I'd like to make 2 suggestions about how we can build on the great work from the cluster, perhaps from slightly different perspectives. And this will become 2 action points. The 2 perspectives I'd like to take are how can investigators contribute to the discussions at the cluster, and how can broader stakeholders contribute to the discussions at the cluster. The example that Irmgard gave of having standards that can be applied in different ways rather than specific data sets, I think is a good one. But I do wonder whether you can have those conversations without taking account of the needs of the stakeholders and the perspectives of the investigators. So I'm suggesting that there's some way to include investigators and stakeholders in deciding what is the best way to look at antibiotics. Now, that could be done by people reporting to their local agency, be it Europe, Japan, or the UK. But it may be, would it be possible for investigators to have some standardized way of presenting themselves to the cluster? So that, that just as you've mentioned the IACT and the paediatric network and the potential IMI2, we're planning to have a paediatric network cluster in the same way as the regulators are. As I say, copying is the best form of praise. And is there a way for that to be done in a standardized way? So the action point I'd propose is that there are discussions between the paediatric network cluster and the paediatric regulatory cluster to identify standardized ways to contribute to cluster discussions through agencies or directly. And I hope we can have those discussions in the next 12 months. And analogously, I think the broader stakeholders need to have ways to contribute to this, that this group represents a prototype for European stakeholder forum. There need to be similar groups in the US, in Japan, in South Africa, or wherever. And those groups need to align themselves, particularly in rare diseases, because we do need one approach from stakeholders that allows this way of working that respects local needs, but also has some degree of harmonization globally. So a second action point for discussion would be to have some way that stakeholder fora can contribute to cluster either through local agencies or directly. So slightly provocative 2 potential action points. Thank you.
Sorry to step into this way, but just to follow up to what Mark was saying, we have already some contact with some research consortium, NIH research consortia in the rare disease field, obviously. And apart from what Mark was already mentioning, one of the critical aspects was what we were mentioning in the previous session, and is data and how to exchange data and how to standardize the exchange of the data among these different consortia. But this should be done in collaboration also with the regulators, because that has implication also for the registries and also has implication for all the further development. So I think that, I don't know if it's a sub-action point of Mark action point, but I think that this is another critical aspect that should be taken in consideration.
Following the comment by Mark, I think we should avoid duplication of forums and should not implement in the US the forums that we are doing in Europe, which are at the moment international. So we need to have approach strategy forum with everyone in the room at the same time, because pharma are global and we need to work together across Atlantic and beyond in terms of pediatric development, because we are addressing rare diseases.
Thank you. Before giving you the opportunity to comment, I saw there were two other persons, one in the back.
Thank you. Pam Cairns, Paediatric Oncology, and also representing European Society of Paediatric Oncology. I was really interested in the work of the collaboration between the clusters for EMA and FDA discussing so many important issues. And it was particularly interesting that you commented there were 156 general topics discussed in these telephone conferences. So I'd just like to make a suggestion that given that's a huge amount of very important information, and we've been talking about sharing data, whether there's a possibility of the information, particularly on what is convergent, but perhaps we're more interested in what is divergent, to be made available, because there is an area on the EMA website about the work of these international clusters, but there is very little that says what has been agreed and what could be taken forward in collaboration. And I wonder if more of these discussions could be published for the benefit of all the multiple stakeholders involved, whether it be industry, academia, or patients and parents. And then my second point was really to endorse the comment made by Andy Pearson earlier. The workshop today is very much not about changing the regulation, but implementing what we have, or better implementation of what we have. And given that the mechanism of actions has been recognised by EMA as an important element of the paediatric regulation, can we look to use what is already there to try and align something close to the RACE Act, even if we aren't actually changing legislation at this particular point?
We will basically now collect the questions and comments before they're...
Hi, it's Richard Vart from Lilly Eurobio. Just a quick question. I was really interested in the common commentary and the collaboration that happens there. I just wondered, why can't sponsors ask at least to be considered, or is this going to be the future?
The initial thought was that it was started as a pilot, and we have not been really sure of whether it would be kind of an avalanche and we would be overrun by requests and discussions. Our experience so far is that it really is appreciated by companies if we send them the information. We have increased. There was this, as Sandy mentioned, this European EMA FDA bilateral where we agreed to increase the number of issuing common commentaries. We have received and we are listening to companies' requests if they suggest and ask whether it could be considered and be discussed at the pediatric cluster. We cannot guarantee and to all, but we definitely do listen to them, and everyone is free to suggest that it be discussed at the cluster, and then it will be brought forward, and then it will be a mutual agreement on whether or not to put it on the cluster.
Thanks a lot.
Hello, I'm Dirk Leutner from the European Directorate for the Quality of Healthcare, of Medicines and Healthcare, Council of Europe, Strasbourg. we started a project on a European paediatric formulary for compounded preparations, and the idea is to fill the gap until licensed products are available in all European countries. As our focus is on old drugs, we have seen that products are available on single markets, so is it either US or in single European countries? So that comes to my question, is there any initiative to exchange on products which are already licensed on single markets but not in others, so within Europe or beyond with other regions?
I don't think that's the case, certainly, and as part of these discussions, they have more than enough material to cover with, ongoing development plans. Yeah, I think perhaps in other forums, but not this particular one.
Martina Penazzato, WHO. You did talk about the desire of going beyond borders, and it's very clear to everyone how the discussion you have implications globally. So how do you currently capture some of the potential low and middle income countries issues in your discussion, and do you see any way to potentially do that better in the future? And is the sort of stakeholder forum that was mentioned in suggesting the action a way forward potentially?
I think some of the things that have been suggested today really would greatly expand the scope and workload of this gathering of staff between FDA, EMA, TGA, PMDA, and Health Canada. Okay, so these are these are regulator to regulator conversations. They have not sought to bring in every regulatory body in the country, in the world. There are other forums, we hope, in order to do that, and we try to participate in those. But this group doesn't have the capacity to expand beyond what they currently do today. I think it's also there have been many discussions about how to bring in other stakeholder perspectives, whether that be industry, academia, patient groups, and they rely largely on fora that each agency participates in outside of the cluster itself to bring the learnings into the regulator-to-regulator conversations. In order to participate in these discussions, the confidentiality agreements are really tight and robust. So opening up the monthly pediatric cluster meetings to multiple stakeholders immediately changes the conversation. Immediately. So if that is something that's desirable, I think that the agencies would have to look at how they would resource that, how they would do that how this might be done differently. But one of the things that the participants take very, very seriously is being able to reflect perspectives from the broad scope of interfaces that they have outside of the cluster itself.
One last comment?
Yeah, maybe one last comment, or maybe a little bit of a plea. I think we as industry aware that we have this cluster discussions, but we not always aware that our own product is discussed there, and we're not informed what is maybe the outcome, which also sometimes then leads to repeating that discussion with both agencies again. So while I can see why you can have hundreds of people on the phone call, I would really plea for more transparency. And that can be done, I think, in the range of confidentiality. Just give a feedback and a brief info to the company concerned by the
We're actually looking at, the group is actually looking at how to do that. Yeah.
Very quickly, my name is Janina Karras. I work at EMA in the pediatrics team. I was just wondering, in that context, EMA FDA interaction, whether you might want to say something about the parallel scientific advice, which might also be a good alternative, actually, for having an exchange between FDA. EMA
I think you just said it. We do, for companies, we do have a pretty well-defined program in providing parallel scientific advice. Pediatrics is an area that companies can come to us and ask for FDA and EMA input on development programs. You could do it on any area, really, but pediatrics is certainly an area that we would likely pay attention to. And we've already agreed between us that it is our goal to find alignment wherever possible in pediatrics and development programs. So I would encourage you to make use of that if you want your product discussed. And then there you do have an opportunity to meet with each agency and both agencies at the same time to hash out areas that need further discussion and alignment.
Thank you very much. Mindful of the time, I think we have now, unfortunately, to close this session. Thank you very much, Sandy. Thank you very much for the interesting comments, contributions, which shows also the international picture of the discussion we have today, which certainly has to continue and can now also continue over lunch. There will be a lunch buffet outside the room. We said that you will have 45 minutes for lunch, so go quickly out there and enjoy your lunch. We meet then again at 5 minutes after 1 o'clock to continue the discussion with the 3 afternoon sessions. Thank you very much.